This morning, if you are a guest, we want to welcome you and say thank you for coming here and being a part of this. Really appreciate you guys being here and hope that you have felt welcome. If you are one of those who likes to take notes, then you are in luck. We have an awesome greeting team. When you walk through the doors, they gave you a whole bunch of papers, and on one of those papers, you'll find the sermon outline. There's lots of blanks that you can fill in if you would like to follow along. Now, every time I preach, I love to start off with a word of prayer. And to me, I think, here we are diving into God's word, looking to what he has to say to us. There's no better place to start a message than with a word of prayer and to invite God into this journey together. Normally, I would say this prayer, but I've actually invited my good buddy from the student ministry, Matthew Downer, to come and to pray. So Matthew, would you come up here on stage? There you are. All right, let me get you a microphone here real quick. Matthew is in our student ministry program, and he's also a student leader, and really appreciate all he does. So Matthew, would you lead us in a word of prayer during this time, please?
Dear Lord, thank you for this wonderful day where we get to all gather here once a week, and please help us to really take a lot from Brandon's message today for it to impact us and send us back out into the world changed so that we may show you throughout our everyday lives. And please help this week for others to see you in us and for us to serve our community. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. Let's give Matthew a round of applause. Good job, Matthew. Now, last week, Ray Jester, our worship pastor, preached a message. He concluded our series called Important, and we talked about a whole lot of different important topics for us to look at in the Bible, and he finished out the series by talking about the importance of Advent, the season leading up to Christmas Day. And he certainly did a great job. One of the questions that he asked in that message was, what is one thing that you have to have for it to feel like Christmas? What is one thing that you feel like you have to have in order for it to feel like Christmas? Well, for me, that is undoubtedly a Christmas tree. I love Christmas trees. There's always been something so special to me about having a Christmas tree in my living room, all lit up. I love to come downstairs during the Christmas season, turn on my Christmas tree lights, make my breakfast, play a little bit of Christmas smooth jazz, eat my breakfast, read my Bible, and just kind of enjoy like that Christmas atmosphere. I'm kind of strange like that, but I just love Christmas trees. And it's funny because I know that Christmas trees can oftentimes be the subject of some arguments in the family, right? I mean, you have those conversations on when are you going to put the Christmas tree up? When are you going to take it down? For me, I would love to have it up year-round, let alone, before Thanksgiving. But my wife is like most normal people in that they prefer to have the trees up after Thanksgiving and, either right just a couple days after Christmas or maybe, early January. And that's fine too, I guess. But for me, I love Christmas trees. And you can imagine, by the way, when I walked in one morning earlier this week and I saw this ginormous beast of a Christmas tree up here. I was a very, very happy man. I know Leanne Patterson, you had a whole team put this all together. They did a great job. Looks wonderful, and it made this guy a very, very happy man. But this series that we're starting this morning is called the Christmas Family Tree. But it deals with a little bit different type of tree than what we might see displayed right here. We're talking about the family tree of Jesus Christ. If there's ever one chapter in all of the New Testament that I believe is probably skipped over more than any other chapter in the New Testament, I would imagine that would have to be Matthew chapter 1. You see, in Matthew chapter 1 is Jesus' family tree. It's his genealogy, and there's a lot of names in there. So-and-so begot so-and-so, so-and-so gave birth to so-and-so, and it can be very daunting as you start to read that. But if you brave it and you start to read through it, there'll be some names in there that might seem familiar. There might be some names in there that might not seem so familiar. But let me encourage you that with each of those names comes a story. And with each of those names comes a legacy, and it all points to Jesus. Now this morning, speaking of legacies, I would like to share with you the story and the legacy of a man by the name of Nguyen Nguyen. You can see his picture up on the screen. Nguyen was born in 1927, and he grew up in North Vietnam. As a young adult, he joined the French army. He married a woman whose name was Sam, and together they had 3 children by the 1950s. And it was during this time that the Vietnam War was developing more and more, and communism was growing stronger. So in the 1950s, Twin and his wife Sam and their 3 kids, they immigrated from North Vietnam to South Vietnam. While he lived there, he and his wife had another 6 kids, so they had 9 kids living in South Vietnam. He worked as a police captain in a neighboring town. He wanted to keep his family safe from his profession, so he would travel to another town, and he was a very highly respected police captain. He protected a lot of people. He had a lot of responsibility. So during this time, he worked as this police captain, and as he continued to work, the Vietnam War developed even further, and as many of you know, it led to the fall of Vietnam to communism. The Americans were leaving the country, and it just got to the point where Twin knew that if he was going to keep his family safe and give his family a better life, it was best for him to leave so that he and his family could have a better life. So in 1975, Twin made the difficult decision to, yet again, leave his home, to leave his job, and to leave everything that he knew, and to find another place to live so that he and his family could be safe and better off. So his goal was to fly his whole family together, but unfortunately some things fell apart, and he wasn't able to do that. So Twin ended up having to take a boat to Guam by himself. And in the meantime, his family took another boat to Hong Kong. Now, this is 1975, before the era of cell phones. So you can imagine how Twin must have felt during this time of having to separate from his family and not knowing what all was happening to them. But eventually, one Christian man helped to reunite this family and bring them over to the States. And they flew in, and there were Christian families that were there that greeted them and that helped give them a new start in America. Twin and his wife, Sam, worked as janitors in one of the churches that supported them. They gave them a home, a place to live, and that would be his career for pretty much the rest of his life. One of the younger kids from Twin and Sam, a daughter, would grow up in Oklahoma, would grow up in this church, and would eventually marry a Christian man. This man, by the way, as a young boy, was part of the entourage that had welcomed them to the States when they had first gotten there. How cool is that? Right? So Twin's daughter marries this man. They start a family, and they have a daughter. And this daughter would eventually grow up and go to a Christian school in Searcy, Arkansas, where she would meet a stunning young man who was pursuing a degree in business. So they eventually married, and they moved to Sarasota, Florida. And it was here that they got involved in the local church, and the wife, Twin's granddaughter, had signed her and her husband up, without her husband knowing, that they were going to teach a middle school Bible class. And the husband reluctantly agreed, but eventually learned his calling and his passion for teaching teenagers about Jesus. And so Twin's granddaughter's husband eventually became a youth minister himself, and 4 years later moved to become the youth pastor here at Sarasota Christian Church, who is preaching this very sermon to you right now. If you haven't figured it out just yet, this is the story of my wife's grandfather, Twin Win, and as a matter of fact, that is my wife as a baby, and that is her grandfather. What an amazing story. An amazing story of one man who was willing to risk it all to escape Vietnam, to escape communism, and to start a new life for his family. And he had to risk it all. He had to leave everything that he knew so that he could have a better life for his family. And now you may have never heard of Twin Win until this morning, but you have certainly been affected by his story and by his legacy. I truly believe that if Twin had never risked it all for his family and had left and come to the States, and I truly believe that if my wife had never signed us up for that middle school Bible class that I was reluctant to teach, I don't know that I ever would become a youth pastor, and I don't know that I would ever be preaching the sermon to you right now. But isn't it amazing how one man born in Vietnam in 1927 can affect a church in Sarasota, Florida in 2018? And even though sadly he passed away back in 2013, his legacy and his story continues to affect you even right now. There's something powerful about somebody's legacy. There's something powerful about somebody's legacy and how it can impact generations after them. And this morning what we're going to see, what we're going to learn, is that we're going to look at one man who also left his home, his job, and everything that he knew, and how his story, how his legacy would impact people throughout the entire rest of the world. And the reason that it would impact this world so powerfully is because his story and his legacy pointed to Jesus. Now, you will see here, I'm going to move this so everybody can kind of see for just a second. You'll see that Ray Jester, our worship pastor, has built this fancy little Christmas tree here. We're calling this our Christmas family tree. And this will be up here for the next 4 weeks, not years, 4 weeks. And each day we're going to turn one of these around and we're going to tell a story. And in the same way that Ray Jester built this Christmas tree, as you guys saw in the bumper video, God is building a story. God is building a story, and it points to Jesus. So we're going to turn this first one over here, and we're going to talk about Sarah and Abraham. We're going to talk this morning about Sarah and Abraham. Now, before they were Sarah and Abraham, they were Sarai and Abram. And you're going to have to forgive me because their names are so closely related. I'm probably going to mix and match, and I'll call one Abram and call the other Sarah and vice versa. So you'll just have to give me a little bit of grace this morning because their names are tricky. But Abram and Sarai lived in Harriman with Abram's family. And according to Joshua 24:2, Abram's family did not worship the one true God. As a matter of fact, they were idol worshipers. And Abram, in Genesis chapter 12, this is where his story begins. Abram is 75 years old. He is an older man at this point, and this is the type of context we see as we open up in Genesis 12, 1 through 3. The Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." God, in his sovereign will and in his sovereign knowledge, calls out to Abram, a 75-year-old man with no kids, who is a worshiper of false gods, and he says, "If you will listen to me and if you will do as I say, then I will bless you, and I will bless the world through you, through your legacy and through your story." So Abram and Sarai, they left everything they knew. They left their family, they left their jobs, they left their hometown, and they began to travel so that they could listen to the voice of God. According to Hebrews 11, verse 8, Abram didn't even know where he was going. God said, "Travel, and I will show you the place that you will stop and settle down." That's like God saying, "You know what, Abram, leave everything that you have, and I want you to just travel that direction, and I'll just tell you when to stop." Now, put yourself in Abram's sandals for just a second, if you will. Could you do that? Could you leave everything that you've known for your entire life, for 75 years? Could you leave all of that and travel not knowing where you're going to end up? Now, husbands, wives, think about this for a second. God calls you to do that, and how does that conversation go with your spouse? Right? I don't imagine it would go very well if you told your spouse, "Hey, God wants us to leave everything that we've known and to travel," and your spouse says, "Okay, well, where to?" I don't know. I don't imagine that conversation would go well, because think about it. You're leaving your town, you're leaving your family, your job, and you don't know where you're going to go. Where's the security in that? We love security, and we like to feel secure in our finances and with our family and the things that we've established in our life. Where's the security for this story in Abram and Sarai's life? But thankfully, Abram and Sarai do exactly what God said, and they leave their home and they start to travel. Years later, in Genesis chapter 15, God comes to Abram in a vision, and he reminds him of these promises that he had made him in Genesis chapter 12. You know, Abram's not getting any younger, and this promise that God has given to him kind of requires like a child, kind of requires a son. If nations are going to come through Abraham's family, then sure enough, you need a child, and Abram's not getting any younger. But it says that Abram believed God, and it was counted to him as righteousness. Some more time passes, and Sarai gets a little impatient, waiting for God's promises to be fulfilled. So she begins to think, well, maybe I just need to get a little creative here, right? Maybe what God meant is I'm supposed to give my husband my servant Hagar. And maybe he needs to marry Hagar, sleep with her, and they'll have a child, and she's a little bit younger than I am, and so, maybe that's how God is supposed to bless this family and bless the whole world. And so Abraham, begrudgingly, I'm sure, does that, right? And so then just months later, they have a baby. But this was not the promised baby that God had mentioned, and as you can imagine, understandably, there was some tension, some conflict between Abraham's two wives. And so Hagar escapes and leaves and is in the wilderness, but we serve a God who sees. And so God saw her in her distress and blessed her and encouraged her to go back to her family, to Abram and to Sarai. So then we get to Genesis chapter 7, where Abram is now 99 years old. And God speaks to him one last time, reminding him of this covenant promise. It's been 25 years, and God is present, and he says, Abram, I'm here, and I'm going to remind you of these promises, and I'm still going to provide that child. I'm still going to provide that legacy that I promised you all these years ago. Listen to what God says to Abram in Genesis 17, 4-7. As for me, God says, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of the descendants after you. God's talking about something big here. He reminds Abram of these promises. He gives Abram a new name, Abraham, and then he says, kings are going to come from you. And sure enough, as you read the rest of the story of the Bible, what you find in the Old Testament is that King David, a very familiar face in the Christian world, King David comes from this line, from this legacy of Abraham. King David has a son, wise son, Solomon. But eventually, as you continue to read, what you'll find is King Jesus comes from Abraham's line as well. So kings are going to come from this line of Abraham, but also there's this everlasting, this eternal covenant. And as we read the New Testament, what we find is this everlasting covenant, this eternal covenant, is fulfilled ultimately in Jesus Christ. And it is through him that we have forgiveness, that we have redemption, that we are adopted into God's family. And it is only through this legacy, through this story, through King Jesus, that we can be a part of this everlasting covenant. So Abram and his wife, they get their wish. They finally have a son, and they name him Isaac. 25 years later, from the time that Abraham was 75 until this point, 25 years, they have been waiting and anticipating and excited about God fulfilling this promise. And 25 years later, here it is. Now, my wife and I are expecting our first baby on February 1st. And there's been a lot of excitement, a lot of anticipation. Yeah, thank you. We're super excited about it. We can't wait. In some ways, it seems like time has just flown by. But in other ways, it feels like time is just inching because we are so excited and we just can't wait to meet this baby boy. And it's been a lot of fun, but it's only been 7 months. Really, 7 months isn't that long to wait. I can't imagine what it would be like to wait 25 years with this type of excitement and anticipation. But 25 years go, and sure enough, they have Isaac. So now Isaac gets to be a little bit older, and God does something that doesn't make sense to me. God does something that's really confusing, and it's very drastic. He tells Abraham, he says, I want you to sacrifice your one and only son. this son of a promise, this son that you've been waiting 25 years for, I want you to sacrifice him. But Abraham is a man of faith, and he does what God asks of him yet again. And so Abraham, he takes this wood for the sacrifice of his own son. He takes this wood, he places it on his son, and together they travel up the mountain to the altar where he is to be sacrificed. And if you've grown up going to church, you know how this story ends. You know that God stops Abraham right before he sacrifices his one and only son, and instead they find a ram in the bushes, and that ram takes the place of Isaac. And just like Isaac, the one and only son of Abraham, who would carry the wood for his own sacrifice, one day, just like Isaac, a descendant of Isaac would carry the wood for his own sacrifice. But unlike Isaac, who was spared from death, Jesus Christ, the one and only Son of God, would not be spared. And just like the ram who took the place of Isaac there on the altar, Jesus Christ took our place on the cross. Jesus Christ is the main character of this story. And I hope that through this summary, we've skipped over a lot of different details, but I hope that through this summary and through this story, what you'll see is that through Abraham's life, through his actions and the things that he did, and through his family tree, through his genealogy, it all pointed to Jesus. Abraham was not the main character, he was a supporting character who was pointing to the main character, who is Jesus Christ. So the challenge for all of us today, as we look at the story of Abraham and Sarah, is we need to live a life and to leave a legacy that points to Jesus. After all, your legacy can impact generations to come powerfully when it points to Jesus. Your legacy, when it points to Jesus, can impact generations to come powerfully. So if that's the challenge, if we're to leave a legacy that points to Jesus, well, how do we do that? What are some things that we need to do? Well, there's kind of a sobering realization. If we want to leave a legacy that points to Jesus, then we need to realize that we are not the main character in the story anymore. We are not the main character in the story anymore. In the same way that the story of Abraham really just points to Jesus as the main character, we need to recognize that when we become Christians, when we call Jesus Lord and Master over our life, we are no longer the main character in our story. God is. And that might be a hard realization for many people, especially in our culture that we live in today, where making much of ourselves is a way of life and maybe even a necessity. Let me explain. Think about it. If you are a student and you're in school, you have to get good grades, you have to do all of these extracurricular activities, you have to have leadership responsibilities. Why? Well, A, because they make you a good person, but B, because you want to point to those accomplishments and you want to say, look how awesome I've been. I am worthy of going to college. All of you colleges I'm applying to, I am worthy of being a student at your school, and I'm worthy of these scholarships that you're dishing out, right? You want to point to all of these accomplishments and say how awesome you are so that you can get the best scholarship, so you can get a good education. Now, if you're applying for a job, what do? You send a resume. And in that resume, it's all of your accomplishments, and your goal is to try to look better than the other people who are also applying for the job. Right? So on your resume, you have everything that makes you look so awesome, and you point to those things and you say, I am worthy of being an employee at this position. Right? And if you can get your resume through to the right people, maybe, just maybe, you'll have an interview. And if you're smart, you'll dress up, you'll look nice, and you'll present yourself well. Right? And you'll try to make yourself look as good as possible, and you want to point to all these accomplishments and say, I'm worthy. I am worthy of all of these things, right? Now, let me make sure I make this point that none of those things are evil, right? I mean, you want to be wise and you want to get a good job, students. You want to get good grades, right? It makes you a better person. You learn lots when you're in school. None of those things are evil, and if anything, they're wise. But The point that I want you to see is that in our culture, it's very easy to get caught up living our lives for ourselves and making ourselves in the middle of the spotlight. We want to put the spotlight on us in self-glorification. So in today's society, it has also become easier to be famous, right? With YouTube and other video hosting sites, all you have to do is fall down a flight of stairs, and if somebody records it, you post it on YouTube and you're famous, right? Or you could become famous for something as simple as opening up toys and playing with them. Right, one YouTuber, for example, in 2014, one YouTuber made almost $5 million just by opening up Disney toy packages and playing with them. And I don't know about you, but opening up toys and playing with them and making $5 million, that sounds like the kind of job, right? That's like the dream job right there, right? In a world like that, and in a world where you can post your opinions with just the click of a button, in a world where the customer is king, where you can have it your way because you deserve it, two marketing slogans that we hear on a regular basis, right? In a world like that, it's so easy to get caught up in living a life of self-glorification. But Jesus turns this all on its head when he says in Luke chapter 9, verse 23, he says, "Whoever wants to be my disciple, whoever wants to follow after me, whoever wants to be a Christian must deny themselves and take up their cross daily and follow me. For whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will save it." So now, while we live in a culture that tends to glorify self, we need to be a humble and confident people who glorifies Jesus in our lives. So that doesn't mean that you can't submit a resume and apply for jobs and point to the things that God has done in your life and the things that you've accomplished to get a good position. And students, get good grades and get those scholarships. Those things are wise and they make you better people. But what it does mean is that we are no longer the main character in our story. God is. It means that we no longer say, "My will be done," but "Your will be done." We say, "My way," we don't say "My way," we say Yahweh. See what I did there? Okay. It's not my way, it's Yahweh. Which brings us to our next point. If you want to leave a legacy that points to Jesus, then you have to submit to the author of life. You have to submit to the author of life. Think about what an author does. The author is the one who writes the story. The author has a lot of power and authority over the characters and over the plot and the direction that the story takes. And in Acts 3:15, Stephen calls Jesus the author of life. And so Jesus is the one with the pen in his hand. Jesus is the one that tells the story what direction to go. He's the one with the authority. He is the one with the power. And in Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, Jesus has resurrected powerfully and victoriously from the dead. And here he is, he's standing on a mountaintop, which I always find it interesting. God uses mountaintops a lot when he's doing something big, right? And so Jesus is standing on this mountaintop, and he tells the disciples, those that are standing there in front of him, he says, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me." All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Well, what is he saying? This is a powerful proclamation that he is the one who is in control. He is the one with all authority. He is the one with the pen in his hand. He is the author of life. And yet with all of his power, with all of his authority, he still gives us a choice. He gives us a choice in his love and in his grace. He gives us a choice. We can choose to submit to his authority, and we can join him in the story that he is writing, or we can pick up the pen ourselves and we can write our own story. Now, make no mistake, we're going to write a story one way or another. But if you read through the Bible, especially the Old Testament, what you find, God shows us what happens when human beings, when we pick up the pen and when we try to write our own story. And let me tell you, it does not have a happy ending. When mankind tries to pick up the pen themselves and they try to write their own story, what you see is it is full of pride. It is full of greed. It is full of bitterness. It is full of despair. And it ultimately leads to death. But we can choose to write our own story, or we can choose to submit to the author of life and in his story. And when we do that, we may not become the main character, but we will be the supporting character in a much larger and in a much grander story than we could ever write ourselves. And trust me when I say that the story that the author of life is writing, it will have a happy ending. Make no mistake about that. Now, people don't like to talk about this idea of submission or surrender. So let me encourage you with this. You can trust God, the author, because he is good. You can trust the author of life because he is good. In the Chronicles of Narnia, Mr. Beaver is telling young Susan who Aslan the lion is. Allow me to read this scene for you. Mr. Beaver says, Aslan is a lion, the great lion. Susan says, oh, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I should feel rather nervous about meeting a lion. Safe, Mr. Beaver said. Who said anything about being safe? Of course he isn't safe. He's a lion. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. You see, God, in all of his power, in all of his strength, in all of his might, with all his authority, he is good. And he is worthy of our devotion, and he is worthy of our trust, and he is worthy of being in the spotlight in our lives. During World War II, a Dutch woman by the name of Corrie ten Boom saved the lives of roughly 800 Jewish people by hiding them inside a special safe room in her house. A Dutch informant betrayed her family, and her family was imprisoned. Many of them were taken to concentration camps themselves, and unfortunately, only Corrie survived. But later on, Corrie would go on to say that we must never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. We must never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. You see, God has revealed himself to us through his creation, through the created things of this world, but also through the Bible, through his word. And the more we come to know who God is, one of the biggest conclusions we will make is that we can trust him. And we can trust him even to the point of stepping out into an unknown future. Doesn't mean that our lives will be free from suffering or heartache. It doesn't mean that we won't have troubles in this world. As a matter of fact, Jesus says in John 16:33, he says, in this world you will have troubles. In this world you will have troubles. Now that sounds like a pretty disappointing statement if you're going to follow after Jesus, but then he continues on and he says, but take heart, I have overcome the world. Jesus says, in this world you will have trouble, but be of good cheer. For I am the conquering king, I am the triumphant one, and I will triumph over every single evil in this world. And one day I will triumph over all of it, all of evil, for good. And I will bring a new heaven, I will bring a new earth, and there will be nothing but peace and joy. So be of good cheer. You will have troubles in this world, but I have overcome the world. This is the God of Abraham. This is the author of life. And so we can trust an unknown future to this known God because he has revealed himself and he is good. So our challenge this morning, as we've looked at the story of Abraham and Sarah, is that we need to leave a legacy that points to Jesus. It requires making God the main character, the focal point, the spotlight of our lives. It requires submitting to the author of life. But we can trust and know that this author of life is good and that he is worthy of the spotlight in our lives. Have you surrendered to Jesus? Have you made him Lord over your life? Have you called him Master and have received him? And are you now a part of the grander story that God is telling? Maybe this morning for you, that's the next step. Maybe for you this morning, you need to surrender your life to Jesus. Or maybe this morning, maybe what you need is you just need prayers over something that's going on in your life. But if you need anything, the band is going to play this next song here in just a second. I will be back by the Christmas tree, because I love Christmas trees, right? So I'll be back there. If you have a desire, a need for prayers, or if you would like to submit your life to Christ, we can talk more about that back there. But let's stand together and we'll sing.